Well, this week we continue the tour of Tate Britain, and we have reached the interwar years, and this, as I was saying, is the last but one of the talks. As usual, I'll talk a little bit about what was going on at the time and how that affected art. I mean, I don't want to get too much into the politics at the time, but I just thought I'd show you this amusing cartoon in Punch, which shows you the British character tendency to keep out foreign politics. It was a time, of course, when fascism was growing across Europe, but this shows the British tourists' isolation, and I think it's a comment on the isolationism of the British people at the time, even though, of course, Oswald Mosley had set up the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s in general. And a similar thing, in a way, applies to art. Remember last week I was telling you about the return to order after the First World War, where people went back to more realistic, conventional ways of painting. Well, that continued through the 1920s and through the 1930s, but there aren't many examples of that type of art, the return to order type of art, in the gallery we're going to be looking at. But you need to bear in mind that it was probably the predominant form of art, certainly the establishment form of art, and it was only the few artists, the avant-garde, if you like, that were influenced by foreign art movements like Fauvism, Cubism, Dada, Surrealism. So that dichotomy, if you like, in English art is well illustrated, I think, by what happened to the 7 and 5 Society. It was called that because there were 7 painters and 5 sculptors, and it was founded in 1919. And this artist, Percy Haig Jowett, was one of the original founders in 1919. You might not have heard of him, but he was influential establishment artist. He became head of the Chelsea College of Art and then later principal of the Royal College of Art. So a well-known artist. And this is a lovely watercolor that he did, a sort of typical of the mainstream art. Then the 7 and 5 Society invited Ben Nicholson to join in 1924, and things changed substantially. Whereas in the first exhibition of, I think it was 1920, the catalogue said, "We feel there has of late been too much pioneering along too many lines in altogether too much of a hurry." As soon as Ben Nicholson joined, and here's an example of Ben Nicholson's work, 1924, the year he joined the 7 and 5 Society. And this is also one of his first 3 completely abstract works. Remember, I was telling you that abstraction was in many ways the idea of abstracting something from a realistic representation. If you build up a completely abstract work, and the term that's often used is concrete art, which is, if you like, purely abstract, mathematical, often mathematical shapes, then that is the art that Ben Nicholson was starting to paint in 1924 when he joined the 7 and 5 Society. And through his influence, he got Henry Moore to join and Barbara Hepworth to join, and they, over the following few years, expelled the non-modernist artists, and it became a society of the avant-garde, exhibiting entirely abstract works in one of their later exhibitions. So that's sort of typical of, or represents art across the country, that divide. And it was the avant-garde who were in the minority, and the majority of work were, well, I'll give you another example, were like this. This is Alfred James Munning's My Wife, My Horse and Myself outside his house. And you can see him, it's a self-portrait. This is his wife, this is him, Alfred Munnings, and you can see there's a conceit here, there's a pictorial joke. He's holding a picture of this painting, a visual joke. It's possible that the title was inspired by a favourite artist, sorry, not artist, a favourite author of Munnings, R.S. Surtees. And in the book, there was a fox hunting hero called Dorrich, who said, "3 things I never lends, my horse, my wife, and my name." And it's thought that this might be a sort of a jokey take on that character in the book. He became one of the finest painters of horses, but also one of the most outspoken critics of modernism. And he's well known for his valedictory speech he gave when he was leaving the Royal Academy. He was president of the Royal Academy, and he left in 1949, and his speech was broadcast on the BBC radio, and he got a bit inebriated during the dinner, and claimed that Cézanne, Matisse and Picasso had corrupted art. And he recounted an anecdote where he was talking to Winston Churchill, who agreed that he would join him in kicking them down the street. That in a way exemplifies the attitude of one group of artists to the avant-garde artists, but it's the avant-garde that is mostly in this room we're going to be talking about today. A final general point, and that is that in 1936 there was an exhibition held in London called the International Surrealist Exhibition, and that really helped to put Britain on the map as a centre for avant-garde art. I'll just draw your attention, you can see here just one part of the exhibition. There's works up here, these lips are by Man Ray, Max Ernst over here. This work is in Tate Modern, and this work here in the doorway is by Alberto Giacometti. So it's sort of typical of the exhibition, and the thing it's best known for is that it almost killed Dali, because he's here in the diving suit, which he hired for the event. There's a little wine glass on top with, I think, a cocktail olive in it. But he gave his talk while still in the diving suit, and because it's designed to have air pushed into it under pressure, he couldn't breathe. He collapsed, and it was only somebody in the audience who realized and managed to undo the bolts of the helmet and take the helmet off. And of course that received a lot of publicity, as did his appearing in a diving suit. I won't talk about all the other characters around him and who exhibited there, because I just wanted to get on with talking about the works of art in the room. And the room is on the right as you go in the entrance. We go in the entrance to Tate Britain, turn right, and it's the 1930s room. This is what we see when we come into the room. You might wonder why there's 3 works of art on the floor down here. Well, they are works that were on display before I photographed the room. They had just been removed, and I find them quite interesting works, but what I'm going to do is to pass them by for now, and if we have time at the end, come back to them, which we might not. I thought I'd start with this work here, Javanese Head. It's Dora Gordine, and the link, the local link, is Dorrich House. Some of you might know Dorrich House on Kingston Hill. It's now managed by Kingston University. For those of you who are lucky enough to have been there, and you have to arrange to go there, excuse me. You have to arrange to go there, and I'm not sure whether you have to go in a group. I went in a group, but Dorrich House is named that way because it's a combination of Dora Gordine, Dora and her husband Richard Hare, Dorrich House. And Dora was, she was Latvian, born to Jewish parents, and we don't know a lot about her childhood, but we do know that she was a skilled artist when she was young, and she had a tendency to make up stories about herself, and so within a few years she had become the daughters of a Tsarist general, and her mother was a princess, but we don't think that was the case. She was good at making up stories. She added the E to the end of her name to make it sound more exotic. She was hailed, though, early on when she came to Britain as a girl sculptor genius. Just a quote from the Evening Standard: "Her bronze heads are most sensitively seen, and they are also more like real sculpture than anything I have seen at the Royal Academy." She visited Malaya, and that's where she produced these heads. And one of them is at the Tate, the Javanese head we see here, and others are at Dorrich House. And she came back from Malaya and to England, went back to Malaya again. In Malaya, she met Noel Coward, Cole Porter, and so on. But she married in Malaya someone called Herbert Garlick, and gave birth to a child, renounced her Estonian citizenship, came back to Britain, and then, for reasons we don't know, she left her husband and divorced him later, and then met Richard Hare when she was having dinner at the Ritz. He was second son of a Viscount, and they married and bought a plot of land on Kingston Hill and built Dorrage House. Switching to another work by Walter Sickert, who we've seen the last few weeks. This is Gwen Franken Davis, a well-known actress at the time. In fact, up till I think the 1980s, she was still acting. And this is a picture of her that's painted by Sickert from a photograph in 1932. And she's playing Isabella of France, and you might wonder why it says La Louve at the bottom, meaning she-wolf. It's because Isabella of France was known as the she-wolf. And what Sickert has done is to paint, and in the 1930s, he started to do this a lot. He painted the portrait from a photograph that he took from the newspaper, and he's acknowledged that. Down here, if I could point to it, it says Bertham Park photo. And he describes, Sickert says, he wanted to make it quite clear by painting Bertram Park photo in the corner that he'd copied it from a photograph. And he said, the photographer has done all the work for me. The photographer has caught the life and movement of the pose. And he has, if you like, copied that particular caught pose in the painting. It was very well received. It was seen by some as, well, the Daily Mail described it as Mr. Sickert's best work. And as I said, he painted a number of portraits from photographs. He liked doing it for some reason because he didn't have to do sittings and draw them spend a long time with the person drawing them. So it was a convenient way of producing portraits. Miss Gwen Franken Davis, I have a photograph of her at the Tate. This is her at the Tate in front of her portrait, this portrait. And it was in 1989 when this photograph was taken when she was 98. And she continued acting until she was in her 80s. She died when she was 101. She was made a dame when she was 100. So that was a well-received work by Sickert. He was a well-known artist by the 1930s. A less well-known artist is Ivan Hitchens' Autumn Composition Flowers on a Table, influenced by the artists like, well, he was influenced by Braque, and we'll see examples of his work later. He was born in London. Hitchens was born in London. His father was fairly successful, but Hitchens won gold medals for his work when he was young. His father was also a painter, less well known, but successful enough to make a living from it. And his mother was an amateur artist. I suppose his dubious claim to fame, the thing I remember, is he was sent to boarding school when he was 7, and he became the go-between between one of the school mistresses in the school and the sexually promiscuous H.G. Wells. So that's a story I remember about him. But he was unhealthy as a boy, and he was not healthy enough to serve in the First World War, but he did work in war service in hospital supply and studied at the Royal Academy. And he was a friend, or his tutors included John Singer Sargent, William Orpen. And he, after college, he joined the London group in the 1930s. I suppose his other thing that he's well known for is I won't say he became a recluse, but the house he lived in during World War II was bombed, and he lived in a caravan in the grounds. It was a house that had grounds, and never rebuilt the house. So for the next 40 years, he lived in a caravan in gardens, which became a secluded wilderness where people would visit him. There was a lake and rhododendrons in the garden, and that's where models would come. And he's well known for his landscapes and his figure painting. And he wasn't, he was visited, but he didn't seek publicity. His son and his grandson are both artists. Oh, this is interesting. This is Julian Trevelyan, The Potteries, I think on a snowy day. And Trevelyan was fairly, well, he was born near Leith Hill, so he's local as well. And he was educated at Bedales. He went to Trinity College, studied in Paris, and then set himself up in Durham Wharf, I think it's called, near Brentford, or in Brentford, and he stayed there the rest of his life. He was a confirmed surrealist, but his surrealist work weren't successful. It was works like this that was successful, which is the point I wanted to make. And interestingly, he called these sorts of these works that he did, this one like the Potteries, his Jekylls. And remember, Jekyll was the good doctor in Robert Louis Stevenson's novel. And works like this one, which is a surrealist work, he called his Hides. And it was the Jekylls, the Potteries, that sold. And his surrealist work, the Hides, he couldn't sell. He did exhibit at the International Surrealist Exhibition, but very few of the works there sold. So it did make Britain's name as an avant-garde centre, but that doesn't mean that suddenly Surrealist work became popular with buyers. During the Second World War, he served as a camouflage officer, as a number of artists did, disguising, he worked for the army, disguising trucks and tanks. And then he taught at the Chelsea School of Art and the Royal College of Art. And it was at the Royal College of Art that he influenced and taught David Hockney. Later, he became a Royal Academician. And then another work by Christopher Wood, because we saw a number of works by Kit Wood last week. And this is the church at Trebul, which is in Brittany. And it's a work that he worked on June, July in 1930. It was a popular area for both British and French painters, close to Pont Avant, which was made famous by Gauguin. And remember, the work of Van Gogh was important to Wood. And it was also, if you remember, 2 years previously, in 1928, is when he met Alfred Wallace in St. Ives, who influenced him to paint in this naive style. And he sometimes, this style is called primitivism, a word that it's gone out of, isn't used because it's fraught with negative associations, these words, these days. But primitivism is used, or was used, in two ways. One is to refer to works that are remote, or areas or cultures that are remote in time, like Pont-Aven, and also to works that are remote in space. For example, in other cultures, works, for example, in Africa that influenced Picasso. And it was that association that was unacceptable, using the word primitive, but with respect to African art. But historically, the word primitive has actually been revered. So going back further, well, going right back, the Greek Golden Age, one of the ages of ancient Greece, the Golden Age, which led to the myth of the pastoral, was regarded as a primitive time when people were closer to nature. And that links in with, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the idea that primitive people are more, in a sense, more advanced because they live in a state of, they're not corrupted by civilization and society. They live in a pure state. But as I said, the term is no longer used, but I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the background of that art term. So back to the room, and I think, how are we doing for time? I think I'll carry on and see if we have time to come back to these three works down there. So moving around the room to the next work, which is by Epstein, Sir Jacob Epstein. And what I'm going to do is to show you, there's a work by his on the other side, which is in fact the earlier work, and I'll show you them both sides together. So the work on the back, Sun God, is 1910, and the work on the other side that we first saw, Primeval Gods, it was 1931 to 1933, carved into the same stone. Or maybe I should say a little bit about carving. I've mentioned before that this was a time when a number of artists were taken with the idea of what was called direct carving, and direct carving was carving into the stone rather than making a model in clay and casting it in bronze. But there was more to it than, I've mentioned that before, but there was a spiritual element to it. Artists believed that every block of stone contained a figure or a form that was waiting to be released. And it was the job of the artist to be sensitive to the stone and to slowly work on the stone, releasing the hidden figure or form that was already in the stone. As I said, it was a sort of spiritual conceit, but it's you need to understand that direct carving was more than just picking up a chisel and having a go at some limestone, which is what Hopton Wood stone is, one of the premier limestones in the country. It's almost marble-like. So the sun god, the one on the left, is the one that he produced first when when Epstein was working closely with Eric Gill, and we saw Eric Gill last week as well. And their idea was to produce a sort of 20th century Stonehenge, in other words, a monumental sculptures which they planned to put in a house in Sussex called Asham House. Asham House is now, it was demolished in 1994. It was, interestingly, for those that know the book, A Haunted House by Virginia Woolf, that house was Asham House in Sussex. And they planned to put these sculptures in the garden of the house. And Epstein had the idea for doing this when he was still a student. He dreamed of producing a temple of love and a temple of the sun when he was a student in Paris. It never really came to that, but Eric Gill and Epstein were working on figures together. And I thought I'd show you this work by Eric Gill, which actually predates. It was, I know they're the same year, but it was earlier that year that Eric Gill produced this, this smaller figure, which is known as Cupid, or sometimes it's called the Cocky Kid. And it was this work, I wouldn't say it was inspired, I would say they were both working together on the same ideas to produce what Epstein called the sun god. He, well, I think I'll have the chance to tell you more about Epstein another time. Next week, I think I'll spend more time on Epstein's life. So let's continue on back to the room and look at the work of William Roberts. Now, Roberts was he won a scholarship to the Slade, and he needed a scholarship because he was born to a poor, well, his father was a carpenter, so a poor working class family in the East End of London. But he was an outstanding artist from a young age. And as I said, he won a scholarship to the Slade, where he won the prize for his figure composition, which enabled him to travel to France. And he became one of the pioneers in abstract art in Britain, even before the First World War. And he became a friend of Roger Fry. Remember Roger Fry's post-impressionist exhibition of 1910, and another one in 1912, in fact. And he signed up, William Roberts signed up for the Vorticist Manifesto, although he called his work Cubist, and he was a gunner in the First World War. Now, this work, Skipping, was part of a larger work called The Gutter. And I've got another part of the larger work here. And he painted, the works were joined together as one long display, and he produced this enormous work because he had read that the Cunard liner, or the new Cunard liner, was commissioning, or was looking for monumental large works to hang in the dining room of the ship. And so he produced this on spec. He wasn't commissioned to produce it, but it never happened. And he was left with the work, which was then cut up. I think between these two, there was another now lost work, which was, I think it was boys on the ground playing with a top, playing with a toy. He continued, he lived till he was 85, and he continued working until in his 70s. And this is one of his later works, which is unfortunately in private collection, called Rush Hour, produced in 1971, when he was something like 76 when he produced this. So you can see he continued painting in a similar style right up to the 1970s. An amusing work, Rush Hour, which is almost a battle between the passengers. Here it looks as though this man is just about to punch this woman in the head, and she's just about to hit him with her handbag first. So it's not sure it's the rush hour that I'm or was used to, even though the bus is going to Waterloo, which is what I used to do. But it's an amusing, exaggerated form of the rush hour. And I think all of it, to me, there's a sort of an element of Stanley Spencer about them, and that element of amusement is taking it too far, but a light-hearted, enjoyable, maybe is a better word. And that leads on to Stanley Spencer, St. Francis and the Birds, 1935. Important to note the year, because the previous year, 1934, was a very successful year for Spencer. Remember, we saw Resurrection, the big painting of Cookham Village Churchyard. That was one of his most well-received and successful years. 1934 was called Stanley Spencer's year. But the following year, when he submitted 5 works to the Royal Academy, 3 of them, including this work, were rejected. And as a consequence of that, he resigned and wouldn't, or took away all of his works, wouldn't exhibit, because he thought they were trying to control, by selecting some paintings and not others, the way that he painted, and he wasn't having that. St. Francis, of course, is known for his ability to talk to the birds and pray with them, and we can see he's surrounded by birds. He seems to be separating a boy and a girl. The girl is holding flowers. I don't know why, but the chickens have little chicks on their back, and on 3 of them, a black chick and a white chick. St. Francis is a large figure who is actually based on a portrait of his father. Now, Spencer said the figure of St. Francis is large and spreading to signify the teaching of St. Francis, which was spread far and wide. So there are elements of the painting which you might not think has any significance, but which to Spencer had deep significance. And it was intended as a painting that would would be part of a gallery of paintings that would represent aspects of Cookham. And this was the high street of Cookham, because, as I told you before, he thought that Cookham was itself a part of heaven, or a sacred location. And so different parts of Cookham for him had deep spiritual significance. So to show St. Francis of Assisi in Cookham for him was a natural fit. The gallery that he intended to display it in which he called Church House, was never actually built. He had no money for a lot of his life. I'll mention why in a moment. But just to finish off the point I made about his father, he also said that it was inspired by a memory of his father, who he saw in a dressing gown going to the larder, and also later he said that on one occasion, don't ask me for the details, but on one occasion his father's trousers were stolen, and he went about the village for a while in his dressing gown. That's that anecdote is reported in his biography. So there's a connection there with memories that he had of his father, portrait of his father, reference to his father, and the spiritual significance of St. Francis and Cookham. Now, I said he had little money. He married Hilda Carline in 1924, so it was, what's that, 11 years before this, and they had 2 children. And in 1929, he met Patricia Preece, who he became infatuated with, despite the fact that she was a lesbian. And he wanted a ménage à trois. His wife wasn't having it. She divorced him 2 years after this, 1937, when he married Preece a week later, and she continued to live with her lover, Dorothy Hepworth, and refused to consummate the marriage or grant him a divorce. And in fact, she took over control of his finances and his house, threw him out of his house, and took all the money that he made from selling works. So that's why he had very little money, and why a lot of his life he lived like a tramp. Right. Incidentally, the work you can see through the door is the work by Jacob Epstein, Jacob and the Angel, that I'll be talking about next week, when I'll tell you a little bit more about the later part of Jacob Epstein's life. But this week, they're hidden away behind there. You can't see it very well. There's a painting which I just mentioned briefly. It's by Kerry Richards, who was born in Swansea, and from a fairly cultured working class family. So the children were all taught music, playing the piano, drawing and so on when they were young. And he constantly won local competitions. And although he first of all, he became an apprenticed electrician, he went to drawing classes in the evening, and it was there that he saw the works of leading art, Renoir, Van Gogh, Monet, Cézanne, and so on, and applied for and won a scholarship to the Royal College of Art. So that's when he married, and later became a distinguished painter. And he was an artist in the Second World War, and then after that became a head of painting in Cardiff School of Art. Here he is showing, and this is his own description, he's showing the title is Two Females, and the females are here and here, and he describes the one on the right, this figure, as virginal, though budding and seductive, and the one on the left is fulsome and latently sexual, in his words. And this is it's a relief work, and this is the last of a series of 12 surrealist reliefs that he produced, and it was exhibited in 1936 at the International Surrealist Exhibition. So there were surrealist painters in Britain at the time. Maybe I should have, I was going to mention it earlier, but loosely speaking, the surrealism is something that an art movement that developed out of Dada, and it was the combination of the unconscious dream world with the real world. And the surrealists believe that people who could, artists and poets, who could combine and unify, bring together their dream world and bring it into the real world, are those that were inspired and creative artists. So it was, and in Britain, the surrealist movement was a tight-knit society that had very strict rules. So there were lots of artists that joined and were thrown out and so on. So it was very precisely defined. But in general, every surrealist artist painted in a different way and had a different take on it, which isn't surprising when it was the outpourings of your unconscious mind. It was also, it was linked to automatic works, and I give you some examples of that later. That is, works that were produced by methods that didn't involve conscious thought. And I'll leave you pondering that and give you some examples later. But before I do, I wanted to talk, I'll talk about Barbara Hepworth and Naum Garbo and then Ben Nicholson. Let's start with Barbara Hepworth, perhaps the best known of the three artists. Now, in 1938, Hepworth became obsessed with the idea of producing very large works, but she had no money or in fact space or in fact time to produce such works. She said at the time, all good sculpture was and still is designed for the open air. So the idea of, she wanted to produce these large works that could stand in the open and be a presence in the landscape. But she couldn't afford to produce them. And this is one of the, she did produce some larger works than this, but they were lost in the Second World War. So this is a very important work, Forms in Echelon, because it's one of her monumental, it's relatively small, but it's one of her monumental works. It was the largest she could produce at the time. It's produced in tulip wood, so an exotic form of wood, or a difficult wood to carve. In fact, you can see there's there's a knot here, and there's in fact a crack in the wood that the Tate has had to repair. And there was a crack, it's hard to see now, but there's a crack at the top, if you look at it carefully, that Barbara Hepworth actually had to repair in the studio. In other words, working with wood, you have to work with the fact that wood is a natural substance and it moves. In fact, having said that, if you look at the base was produced later. It was the work was donated to the Tate in 1964, and the base was produced in the 60s. And you can see here as a line, and in fact you can't see it very well, there's another line over here. It's produced from 3 separate pieces of elm wood. And then unfortunately, I don't know who did it, but they joined the 3 pieces of wood together on the bottom with strips of metal that were screwed to the wood, which was a big mistake, because the wood was, and in fact, the grain of the wood goes in a different direction in the middle. So it was well designed up to the point of putting the metal straps, and the metal straps stopped the wood moving. So when it was at the Tate, it started to buckle. And so the Tate took it all apart, took off the metal straps. And in fact, there's a groove that joins the pieces of wood together now to allow them to move and expand with changing temperature and humidity. I went into some detail to explain that working with natural materials, you're working with the grain, with the faults, with the movement and so on of the material as you work with it. The the name echelon has various meanings, and it's not clear what she intended. In fact, it wasn't originally called forms in echelon. It was called two forms, tulip wood, much more straightforward description. And it was well, echelon is means that it's in military terms, it's a formation where one person stands out a bit further than the row before. I'm not describing it very well, but a marching band of soldiers with one in a step-like formation, and in French it means ladder. And you can see, in fact, that one of these is slightly higher than the other. So there is a sort of a step, but that doesn't really define the work. It's defined more by the fact that they face each other. It's almost like a couple, and you'll notice there's a hole in one, and in fact you can't see the other side, but there isn't a hole in the other one. So they form a sort of a pair, like a mother and child, or a husband and wife, a pair of people facing each other. It was just a comment on the whole, which you might think is a strange thing to comment on, but Henry Moore called 1932 the year of the hole, because the previous year, 1931, his friend and rival, Barbara Hepworth, had pierced her form for the first time. She, if you like, invented the hole. And Henry Moore picked that up and used that in his sculpture. So he was following her lead, which is ironic in a way, because she, not now, but at the time, when she was described in the press, she was often described as the wife of her first husband, the wife of John Skeating, whose work we'll see later, and then later the wife of Ben Nicholson. And then if she wasn't described in that way, she was described as a protege or follower of Henry Moore, which, as we've just seen, she was a leader rather than a follower, although she was in fact 5 years younger than Henry Moore, but not a big difference in age. And critics would describe Moore and Barbara Hepworth in sort of gendered terms. So they would describe, one critic described Moore's work as a tumult, a masculine concept, whereas he contrasted it with Hepworth's work, where she evades disputations of power or of antagonism. She said later she got used to all of this, but it was, in fact, I'll end with what I think is a very nice quote. Although she was demeaned and demoralized by it for a lot of her life, she did say, "A woman artist is not deprived by cooking and having children." And incidentally, the year before, 1930, well, 4 years before this work, she had triplets. So just to continue the quote, "A woman artist is not deprived by cooking and having children, nor by nursing children with measles, even in triplicate. One is in fact nourished by this rich life, provided one always does some work each day, even a single half hour, so that the image grows in one's mind." She did say later in an interview, "Apart from being a woman, it's not been easy always having great bears breathing down one's neck." Well, that's an introduction. I don't think we'd call Naum Garbo one of the great bears. This is one of his finest works. It's one of a number of constructions he did. It's called Construction in Space with Crystalline Center, produced about the same time. Now, it's an odd name because it's a name he invented. His name was, it's Nehemiah Pevsner, and he was born in Southwest Russia. He had Jewish parents, but the reason he changed his name, his brother, Antoine Pevsner, became a well-known artist. He's not very well known today. And so he coined the name Garbo to distinguish himself from his brother. By the way, he's not related to Nicholas Pevsner, the art historian who wrote the Buildings of England, the 46 volumes. Nicholas Pevsner was a German. But anyway, coming back to Naum Garbo, he traveled to Denmark making sculptures, and he went back to Russia. He went to Moscow in 1917. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the revolution, both in the streets, but also in art that was taking place at the time. And he was what's called a constructivist. Constructivism is an art movement that was founded by Vladimir Tatlin and Alexander Rodchenko in Russia. It's the idea is that it isn't a style, it's a product of industry and order. Tatlin described it as a product of an industrial order, like a car or an aeroplane. It's a purely technical mastery and organization of materials, was the way Tatlin described it. I'm not sure I'd describe this work in exactly that way. He was connected, Naum Garbo, with the Bauhaus. So there is a link to imagining this work as an architectural construction. And he produced a number of these constructive forms. Incidentally, it's made in a material that was only recently invented, that you might have heard of now, because it's well known, called Perspex. It's in Perspex, but it was a very new material that he was experimenting with. It became widely used during the war because it was sheets of glass were placed either side of the Perspex to create plexiglass, which doesn't shatter, and that saved the eyesight of a lot of soldiers and sailors, because gun sights and windows and so on were produced in plexiglass. Sorry, bit of a sidetrack. He was working. He left Moscow because he was disillusioned with the pressure from the Communist Party to produce realistic works. He went to Germany. Unfortunately, the Nazis came to power in 1933, and he was a Jew, so he left Germany and went to Paris. He was very depressed in Paris, did very little work, was very poor, but then left Paris 3 years later and came to London, which was very successful for him. He produced, he met someone who he married, who he lived happily with for the rest of his life. It became a center. Just as he arrived in 1936 was the International Surrealist Exhibition, and that he was became friends with a lot of the influential people like the critic Herbert Reed, and was friends of Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth, and he went to the United States for 6 months, but he moved back again and spent most of his the Second World War in Cornwall, where he lived near Hepworth and Nicholson, who had moved down to St. Ives the year after the work I just showed you in 1939. As the war started, they moved down to Cornwall. He did go back, Naum Garbo went back to America after the war, but he wasn't as successful, so he returned to England, received a number of commissions, but it wasn't until, unbelievably, it wasn't until 1957, how old was he then? He was something like 67, that there was a commission he received for a work in a department store in Rotterdam, which was extremely well received worldwide, and his fame soared internationally. And for the last 20 years of his life, he received prizes and honors all around the world, which ended up with him being knighted in 1971. So he's actually Sir Naum Garbo. Right, the third member of the group, Barbara Hepworth, and this work is also by Barbara Hepworth, Naum Garbo, and Ben Nicholson. Ben Nicholson was the second husband of Barbara Hepworth, and also she was his second wife. They worked together in the 1930s. They fed off each other. He was one of the leading figures in pushing the international modern movement in Britain. And here we see one of his quiet, abstract works, relief work. He saw this as international rather than British, utopian, and conveying quietness. And through aestheticism, it's an aesthetic model of social harmony. So in a way, in 1935, his message with this work is peace to the world. He did write in a letter that this relief contains one circle drawn by hand and one by compass, and therefore represents the transition between the more freely drawn and the more mathematical relief. It's actually, I mean, I've looked at them, it's difficult to tell which is the one drawn by hand. I think this is the one drawn by hand and this is the mathematical one. And he also wrote that, I mean, to me, this larger circle here dominates, but this smaller one balances, and this larger one, through its control of this space, sort of pushes this space down to the bottom of the picture. But I shouldn't really be talking like this because Ben Nicholson wrote, "The awareness of this is felt subconsciously, and it is useless to approach it intellectually. So far from helping, it only acts as a barrier." So I apologize from trying to intellectualize this piece. The only way you can approach it is to appreciate it or not. Now, how are we doing for time? Quarter of an hour, and we've got 1, 2, 3. Right, I don't think we'll get back to the pieces that are no longer on display. By the way, this piece on the floor here is now on display in the gallery for reasons that I'll give you when I come to it. But let's start with Brockenhurst. Brockhurst. Gerald Leslie Brockhurst, this is a portrait of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, although she wasn't actually at the time Duchess of Argyll. Well, let's start with her. She was she was Scottish, and her father was a millionaire industrialist, and her she came out, what year is this, 31? She came out in society in, I think, the year before, and she didn't marry the Duke of Argyll until 1947, I think it was, and she divorced the Duke in 1963, and he, in the divorce proceedings, claimed that she had 88 lovers, including David Niven. And actually, we now know David Niven was 18 and she was 15, and she became pregnant. Her millionaire father became extremely annoyed. He forced her to terminate the pregnancy. So, but she was also, it was claimed, lover of Edward VIII, Duncan Sandys, the cabinet minister, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And she married a stockbroker called Charles Sweeney in 1933. Oh, her maiden name was, it wasn't Sweeney, it was Wigham. Wigham was her father's name, Wigham. So in fact, when this was painted, she was Margaret Wigham. 2 years later, she became Margaret Sweeney. And then it was 51 they married. She became the Duchess of Argyll. And so this is named by the Tate. That's the trouble with titles, that you get them at a certain time. So in 1931, this wasn't actually a portrait of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll. It was a portrait of Margaret Wigham. Now, Brockhurst was showed extraordinary, he was the son of a coal merchant, but showed extraordinary drawing ability when he was 12, to the extent that he entered Birmingham School of Art when he was 12. And he's the headmaster of the School of Art, described him as a young Botticelli. He won the gold medal at the Royal Academy, was trained at the Royal Academy. This is not very good quality, but this is a self-portrait that he did later. And he became a celebrated portraitist of society figures. For example, he painted hundreds, but Marlene Dietrich, the Duchess of Windsor, many famous people, and he painted. One of his best known works, in fact, work that's considered a masterpiece, and it's an etching, but he was a painter, drawer, and etcher, is this work called Adolescence. It's an etching now owned by the British Council of Kathleen Woodward, who was a 16 going on 17-year-old model at the Royal Academy, who he met in 1929 when he was 39. And he, I don't know why, but he named her Dorette. So she became known as Dorette Woodward. They eloped together to America, which was an enormous scandal in the press at the time. And in 1939, he moved to America permanently, and where he stayed for the rest of his life. And he was married, but his wife died, and he married Dorette in 1947. Sorry, he divorced his wife and they married in 1947. They lived together for the rest of their life. So this was a highly regarded work at the time. It was reviewed in a lot of the papers at the time, and was regarded as one of, as I told you, one of his greatest works. Let's skip over this work by Winifred Nicholson called Sandpipers, and just briefly, although it is another work by Ben Nicholson, I'll just briefly look at this work, Auberge de la Saule d'Epoise. The reason is I said I would mention George Braque, who was a great influence on the Surrealists and the style of painting, the flatness of the painting, and also the use of text, which Braque with Picasso used in their early Cubist period in around about 1910 to 1912. And he's used it here. This is Nicholson using it. It says Diepoise here, the name of the auberge, but also the name of a traditional dish of Dieppe, which is filet de sole d'Epoise. It's a sole in white wine. So it's being advertised in the window. This is a window. This is drawn on the window, these things. And this is a reflection in the window of Barbara Hepworth. It was a modest hotel restaurant that they stayed in when they visited George Braque in Dieppe in 1932, which is, I wanted to show you this work to make that connection. And then an artist that we saw a bit of last week, David Bomberg. Remember the In the Hold? He produced many portraits of his partner and the artist Lillian Holt. This is one of them. This is called Lillian. He produced many portraits of his partner Lillian during the 1930s. She was shy though, which is why she is actually sitting, it's a bit hard to see, but she's sitting with a black satin dressing gown over her shoulder because she didn't want to pose completely nude. He painted a lot of portraits of her, and he demanded stillness and silence. He could only paint when there was no talking. A lot of artists painting society portraits had to entertain the sitter by creating conversation all the time, but he couldn't work that way. He he originally, when he first met her, encouraged her to become a painter, and she produced a number of works. But I showed you last week In the Hold, I don't know whether you remember it, but let me show you another of his works, which was even better known, The Mud Bath. One reason it became known, it became notorious because when it was exhibited by the Chenille Gallery in Chelsea, it was hung, I think it was hung directly in the window, and it stopped the traffic in King's Road, I think it was. It's actually people that he's simplified in a Cubist style, or his interpretation of the Cubist style. And that's the sort of work that he was producing in just pre-war, 1914. He produced a number of works, including In the Hold, and joined the, or was associated with the Vortex group, but broke away from them and held a one-man show. As I said, this was one of the works in that show in the gallery in Chelsea. But his work started to displease his patrons. They didn't like his Cubist style. In fact, he was invited to become a war artist, but they told him they wouldn't accept any work in any of his Cubist work. And they constrained what he did. After the war, he joined the Communist Party and visited Russia. And his work was, I think nearly all of his work was rejected in the Second World War. And it has been suggested that one of the reasons he wasn't accepted by society in Britain was because he was Jewish. It's difficult to know whether that was true, but his work was continually rejected. He became a teacher, and although his classes were small, he became a legendary teacher. And in fact, two of his students were Frank Auerbach and Leon Kossoff, two of the great painters of the 20th century, British painters of the 20th century. And he visited Spain. He often went down to Cornwall, went to Cyprus and so on, and painted landscapes as well as figure paintings, but never became that successful. So had to make a living as a teacher. John, we haven't got long. This is called Akua Bar. Let me just move on quickly and show you an example of Akua Bar from Ghana. You might have seen these fertility dolls. Akua was an infertile woman who went to a priest who told her to make and care for a wooden doll as if it was her child, and she would then conceive. And so women who want to conceive have men make these dolls, and it was these dolls, in fact, they've become tourist items, and they're more naturalistic, the ones that are produced now for tourists, and you often see them in people's living rooms, these Akua Bar dolls. John Skeeping, who was the first husband of Barbara Hepworth, was a famous sculptor at the time, less well known now, but won a scholarship to Rome, which is where they married. And what he's done is he's taken the same sort of wood, acacia wood, an exotic wood, although it's said that he used a tree that fell in Acacia Road near his studio in North London. He bought the tree and used that. Acacia wood was used in Ghana. And just a final point about the Akan culture in Ghana is matrilineal, which means that ancestry is traced back through the mother rather than the father, as we tend to do, because that's the way names pass in this country. But in the Akan culture, it's through the mother. So it's girls who are extremely important. Everybody wants to have a girl child. And the large rounded head here signifies intelligence, because the head was where the Akan culture saw knowledge residing. And so this is an intelligent adolescent, a girl in the prime of life. The ringed neck signifies rolls of fat, because in other words, she's healthy, and she's also survived childhood where many children died. So it looks like a child, but it represents the vision, if you like, of the way you'd want your child to reach adolescence, to be intelligent, to be wealthy and healthy. The protruding breasts of this figure here represent the fact that she is still an adolescent and hasn't yet given birth or nursed a child. But as I said, they've become tourist items now. But this is an original Akui bar which inspired John Skeeping. And then finally, although I've only got a few seconds, to this work is on display now in the gallery, because in 2019 the Tate acquired 5,000 sketches and drawings were bequeathed to this little known surrealist artist Ethel Carhoon. And this is Scylla, or Scylla, I should say, Scylla, the female sea monster between Charybdis and Scylla is sailors had to sail. You see a boat sailing between the Scylla sea monster and the Charybdis, originally in Greek mythology, a monster, later a whirlpool, which the sailors had to, and if you came too close to the monster had 6 heads with triple rows of sharp teeth. The monster would eat the sailors, and if you went too far the other way, you would be eaten by the monster in mythology or get sucked into the whirlpool. And the final point, because I said I would mention it, of techniques used by Ethel Carhoon and other surrealists. There's a whole range of techniques, including fumage, where you get smoke from a lighted candle to create impressions on a piece of paper or card that you hold above the candle and turn that into work. So it's unconscious. It's surreal is the combination of the unconscious and the conscious. There's decalcomania, which is where you blot ink or pigment between 2 sheets of paper to create a mirror image. There's entopic graphomania, where you draw dots between the tiny little imperfections you see in a blank sheet of paper and join them up with curved or straight lines. And there's Pasomage, which is where you spread charcoal or chalk dust or across water and then lift it out of the water using a stiff piece of card, and turn all unconscious ways. And Leonardo da Vinci actually suggested that you sketch the moss on a wall, and that staring at the moss would give rise to visions of forms. Before one final thing I must say, because some of you have wondered that this might have wondered, this looks like two knees. Yes, she said she drew this like this drawing in the bath, and these are her knees, and the seaweed is in place of the pubic hair. So it's a visual joke, pun with various associations. I've gone over by a couple of minutes, and just to remind you that next week we will be turning around, we will going through the door to the 1940 rooms